I don't even know where to begin. Looking back, it's hard to believe we did this willingly. We decided to camp in an isolated forest, far from any signs of civilization, a decision that, in the comfort of the city, seemed like nothing more than an adventure. But reality hit us like a weight the moment we set foot in that place. The silence was so intense it felt suffocating, a quiet so absolute it seemed to compress the air around us. Our flashlights were the only source of light, casting uneven shadows on the trees around us, as if they themselves were watching us. We pitched our tents hastily, trying to mask our discomfort, while some of us went off to collect firewood, and others busied themselves setting up the area. As the night wore on, we sat around the campfire, trying to fend off the unease with chatter and laughter. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows in the dense forest. But even there, in the warmth of the fire, something about the atmosphere felt strange, almost heavy. That's when we heard the first sound, a faint, distant whistle that seemed to emerge from deep within the woods. At first we laughed, saying it was just the wind or some animal, but the sound persisted, repetitive with a cadence that soon caught our attention. Like a melody, it resonated through the trees, gradually growing louder, and the more we tried to ignore it, the stronger it seemed to become. Each of us looked at one another, as if searching for some logical explanation for the sound that refused to leave us alone. The feeling of unease transformed into a palpable fear. It was as if the forest were closing in around us, accompanying that strange melody, and none of us had the courage to leave the light of the fire. We made jokes to break the silence, trying to mask our nervousness, but the tension was clear on everyone's face. The sound seemed to rise from the darkness itself, with a hypnotic rhythm that left us on the verge of silent panic. That night, which had started as an exciting adventure, was turning into an experience I would never forget. That night, as exhaustion forced us to seek some rest, the silence was abruptly shattered by the same sound. But this time, it was closer, so clear and intense it seemed to come from right beside our tents. My body froze with fear. I couldn't move, just listened, trying to control my breathing so as not to make any noise. Each heartbeat sounded louder than the sound outside. It was as if an invisible but undeniable presence circled around us, and I knew I wasn't alone. At one point, I felt a shadow move against the tent's fabric. The silence from my friends confirmed that they too were terrified, and the only thought running through my mind was that this definitely wasn't someone from our group. With the first light of dawn, I finally felt safe enough to step out of the tent. I mentioned what had happened, and the surprise was unanimous. Everyone had heard the same footsteps, the same invisible whispers around us. We decided then to look for any sign that might give us a clue about what was out there. We followed in silence, still cautious, until not far from where we'd set up our camp, we found footprints. They were strange and huge, almost human, but with a frightening distortion. The toes were too long, and the imprints deep, as if something very heavy had walked there. Terror gripped us as we looked at each other, torn between staying or fleeing as fast as we could. One of my friends tried to rationalize, suggesting it might just be some animal, but something about that forest told us we were facing something unusual. None of us could pretend those footprints were normal. There was a weight in the atmosphere, a kind of silent warning, as if the place itself were watching us and waiting for our next move. We decided to head back to the camp, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave us. Each step back seemed to echo on the ground, and what was supposed to be a simple adventure was turning into an experience that would mark us all forever. Against all sense and our growing fear, we decided to spend one more night in the forest as if something were compelling us to stay. But even before the sun had completely set, the sound returned, this time more intense, a sharp, disturbing noise that seemed to pierce our ears and reach straight into our minds. Each note of this sound was like a knife, causing an unbearable discomfort. Panicked, we started gathering our things, driven by a survival instinct that overrode any other reason. But in the midst of our rush, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy, deadly silence around us. In that void, we saw something move among the trees, too fast for us to identify what it was. A thin, tall shadow, almost human, but elongated in a strange and distorted way. Fear overtook us, and no one dared stay to find out what it could be. Then one of my friends screamed, breaking the silence and awakening the urgency we all felt. Without a second thought, we dropped what we were holding and began to run, our flashlight swinging, briefly lighting the path ahead before turning back into darkness. We ran without looking back, with the feeling that any hesitation could be fatal, as if something was pursuing us with every step. It didn't matter what we left behind, gear, tents, anything, everything felt insignificant in the face of the visceral fear driving us to escape that place. The city had never felt so far away, but when we finally reached the road back, none of us had the courage to speak, as if silence were our last line of defense. Back in the city, we all went on with our lives, but with an unspoken rule among us, never to bring up what had happened, as if mentioning it could somehow bring it back. But sometimes in the silence of the night, that sound echoes in my mind, that unmistakable whistle. And it's as if I'm back in that forest. In those moments, I feel a presence, something watching me, pursuing me without me being able to see it. Even though no one says it, I know we didn't truly escape. There's something I feel deep down, a terrifying certainty that one day that shadow will find me, and this time there will be no escape. I didn't know exactly how to begin this, but I feel that telling this story is the only way to lighten the weight I've carried since that night. It all started with an innocent idea. A group of friends, looking to escape the routine and find a bit of peace, decided to camp in an isolated spot. We arrived at our destination on a Friday night, in an area surrounded by tall, silent trees, with a lake that seemed to have been there since the dawn of time. We set up our tents and lit a campfire. The atmosphere was perfect, with a starry sky and fresh air, as if nature itself were welcoming us. Laughter came easily, and stories flowed around the fire while the forest's silence wrapped around us like a comforting blanket. We were carefree, but the tranquility of that night would soon turn into something dark. Suddenly, a dry sound broke the silence. It was as if someone had stepped on a branch, a loud, sharp crack that stopped our conversations instantly. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was just some animal moving through the woods, but the sound left us tense, each of us exchanging silent glances. We tried to keep the mood light, resuming the conversation and laughing again, but the tension lingered, subtle, almost imperceptible. When we finally managed to relax, the noise returned, this time closer and more insistent, like careful yet determined footsteps that seemed to circle us. No one could hide their fear anymore, and each expression reflected the same question: were we really alone? One of my friends, perhaps to prove it was just paranoia, suggested we investigate. Armed with flashlights and hearts pounding, we headed in the direction of the sound, trying to step lightly so as not to reveal our presence. Our flashlights swept through the darkness between the trees until, finally, we caught sight of a figure standing in the distance. It was someone dressed in dark clothing, standing still, simply watching us from within the shadows. We were petrified, unable to move a muscle, as the figure remained there, unmoving. Then, as if responding to our fear, it began to walk toward us, step by step, slowly, without hurry. With each movement, the air seemed heavier, and we all realized there was no turning back. We were facing something we didn't understand and didn't want to understand. Our survival instinct screamed within us with a force we had never felt before. We ran back to the campsite, hearts racing and fear growing with each step, but upon arriving, we realized something was terribly wrong. Our tents were shredded, with fabric hanging in tatters as if someone had deliberately attacked them. Our belongings were scattered, tossed to the ground, and an oppressive feeling of being watched hovered over the place. It was clear that the camp was no longer safe, and with adrenaline dictating our every move, we had no choice but to leave everything behind and run into the forest, without looking back. The darkness closed in around us, and each snapped branch and dry leaf underfoot amplified the terror we felt. As we ran, the sound of footsteps behind us never faded. On the contrary, it echoed in unison with our own movements, maintaining a calculated distance, as if our pursuer were watching us and relishing in our panic. No matter how fast we went, that presence seemed to know exactly where we were headed, following every turn and every detour we made. It was like a sick game, a cruel hunt where the predator had no urgency to catch its prey, only wanting to prolong the fear, keeping us on the edge of despair. The forest became a dark labyrinth, where each tree seemed an obstacle and each shadow a predatory gaze surrounding us from every side. Exhausted and with no sign of an exit, we tried to keep calm, but the sense of imminent danger consumed us, erasing any trace of rationality. In a desperate act, we decided to split up, believing it was our only chance to shake off that relentless pursuer. Each of us ran in a different direction without looking back, focused solely on survival. I ran until my legs gave out, breathing fast and shallow, while every shadow around seemed to contain the face of that stranger. I knew I couldn't stop, that turning back was not an option, and the thought that he might have captured one of my friends made my stomach churn, leaving me with no alternatives. All I could do was keep moving forward, hoping that somewhere there was an end to this senseless nightmare. After running to my limits, I found a clearing, a more open area where the trees gave way to a bit of visibility. There, for a brief moment, I felt some relief as I could see what was around me. The sound of footsteps that had been following me had ceased, plunging the forest into a suffocating silence, so deep it seemed to amplify the beating of my heart. For a second, I almost believed that it had given up, that I was finally free of that sinister presence. But that moment of peace shattered as soon as my eyes fell on something on the ground. One of my friend's belongings, lying in the middle of the clearing like a dark omen. My whole body trembled and every breath felt like it weighed a ton. I knew deep down that he was nearby. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each second. Every shadow seemed to shift, and the atmosphere around me became dense, as if the very forest were trapping my breath. My muscles were tense, every fiber of my being urging me to run, but fear held me in place, unable to look away from that familiar object on the ground. When I finally managed to take a step back, an almost imperceptible sound made my blood run cold, a heavy sigh coming from directly behind me. Every instinct told me not to turn around, not to look back, so I obeyed and ran like never before. My legs moved with desperate speed while my heart pounded in my ears. I ran all night, the darkness following me until the first rays of sunlight appeared on the horizon. When I finally saw a gas station in the distance, a wave of relief washed over me, but the sense of loss remained. Terrified and exhausted, I asked for help at the station, unable to explain exactly what had happened or where my friends had gone. They were never found, nor did I ever return to that forest. I was the only witness to a night that marked me forever. But even today, when I close my eyes, I can hear the sound of footsteps and that heavy sigh behind me, like a ghost haunting my memory.